Oh my gosh. Welcome, Felipe Gonzalez. Welcome to the Work Podcast. How are you?
I am so happy and so honored to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak and to share my insights and my humble opinions on the work.
The work. Felipe, your existence is the work. We were just discussing this right before we hit record, but your existence is the work. You're multi hyphenate and you carry so many identities, and who you are is powerful and it's felt, it's magnetic. How did all of these things, this ball of amazingness, bring you to who you are today?
I think, and I love that you name that this idea of many layers, many identities, many intersections that we find ourselves and identify with ourselves. And so I am an immigrant. I was born in Bogota, Colombia. Immigrated to the States when I was 3. My mother is American, my father's Colombian. So I came into this world already associated with two different ethnic backgrounds, a predominantly like Western European descent and South American Colombian, which I, later on in life did like a DNA test and found that a big portion of my heritage is English, Irish, Portuguese, and Spanish, and indigenous native. They think primarily like Incan, but they can't like pinpoint it exactly. But
Mhm.
right away, I just in my ethnicity come from many walks of life, and when I also hit puberty, I also identified as a gay man, and so all of those different layers and identities are happening on a subconscious level. It's like whether you are like aware of it or not, uh, society has already put labels and containers and projections on how you need to be and how you can move through the world. And I was very blessed to have such a strong connection to spirit because for as long as I can remember, I have been told no. I've been told, like, as a child, that, like, that, like, little boys don't play with My Little Ponies, or that little boys don't like to sing, dance, or do creative activities. And I, I mean, not as a child, but like the spirit was, fuck you, I'm going to do
Mhm.
this anyway.
Mhm.
Um, but, all of that resilience, and I hate that word, but all of that
Mhm.
resilience of being able to go against the system and go against, what society has conditioned upon me, like really took a toll on me. And in my late 20s, no, my mid 20s, and when I moved to New York, I was feeling burnt out. I was feeling angry. I was feeling so overwhelmed and triggered by so many different things, especially being in New York City. And so I came to the yoga practice to just like really to like get my body nice and limber because I was a dancer. And there was this real cognitive shift and change after I practiced yoga. And I was taking yoga classes at like New York Sports Club. But
Mhm.
I think that's a testament to, um, the technology that comes from a lot of indigenous practices. It's like it works. You don't really have to do much else for it to start to have an impact on you. And when I started having this awakening of who I was and what I needed from myself, what I needed to accept in myself, what I hadn't been able to see or articulate uh, in a way that brought clarity on who I was and how I could make an impact in the world. And we were saying, before the recording, how you know the technology of yoga was never about the body. It was always a philosophical construct to help you organize your life experience, and in many ways revolutionize the way that you respond to life. And if yoga is really a practice of liberation, and if I want to be free, then my liberation is bound to the collective. And there's a Buddhist saying that says, if one is suffering, we are all suffering. And I think it's important for me, in regards to doing the work, to continue to pull back the layers, to pull back the filters of conditioned bias, of my own internalized bias, and to really witness people for who they truly are and where they truly are in their journey, so that I can truly be of service. Because you know, if you're just trying to save somebody because you want to feel good about yourself without really understanding the context or the circumstances that they're coming in, then that's textbook case of a savior complex, you know. And I don't want to perpetuate that, but I do want to help people. And so I think that is why I have been so dedicated to this unlearning and this, in many ways, expanding my field of vision to really see what's not being seen, to understand these sort of invisible constructs that support all of our social and societal interactions. And, you know, when you see something, you can't unsee it. And so now that is really the foundation of why I teach, and also who I want to be in the world, is to help people wake up and to give people tools and techniques to be able to cultivate personal well-being so that they can participate in communal well-being.
Oh my gosh.
Woo!
I told Brittany I could feel your energy even before we like let you in. I was like, Felipe's energy is so calming.
Well, and it's because like my default is very passionate. It's very dare I say, chaotic at moments. And so the practice has really helped me mediate that so that I can capitalize on the benefits of being a passionate and as I say, a deeply feeling person, without it letting like become so overwhelming that it interrupts my life experience.
Yeah. So when you first got into yoga in New York City, what were some of the red flags or some of the things you experienced where you were like, this doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel aligned to the practice of yoga?
So I really started practicing yoga because I moved to New York to be a theater actor. You know, like I studied musical theater in college, and for the first 9 years in the city was working as a professional actor on the stage. And there was so much rejection, and hindsight's 2020 when I look back of this racial profiling in casting in entertainment, that was really hard for me to navigate because I didn't fit in a perfect box, you know, because I was of mixed ethnicity, because I was queer, because I didn't show up the way that I was supposed to, like on paper, or on stage. Yoga became a practice of self acceptance and a practice of self regulation. And when I decided to leave the yoga, or to leave the theater space and to pursue yoga as a full time career, at first I thought it was a really welcoming and inclusive space. And, you know, Brittany and I both know each other from a studio in New York City that kind of really touted that message, that it was a community of belonging, that it accepted all walks of life. And, you know, I really found a home there. But then as I started to inhabit more of those spaces, the same walks of life I kept encountering. And it was often, able bodied, cisgendered, heteronormative white females. And, after a while, like it started to present itself as a real issue, especially when it came to teaching a practice that is, by virtue of origin, came from the Indian subcontinent. And there were a lot of discrepancies and in what was being shared in those spaces and what was actually like lived experience and text that comes from the Indian subcontinent. And I started working with an organization called Breathe for Change, which was very active on social justice, and that was really my on ramp to the social justice highway, and kind of um, the catalyst that launched me into this work, because I had no idea of the internalized oppression that I was experiencing, and also the internalized superiority that I was then perpetuating in those yoga spaces. And oftentimes I would see and experience, and sometimes even repeat, this toxic guru culture of it's my way and my authority, and no other perspectives or viewpoints are allowed to even be considered. And as I continued to explore this work, this understanding that like I can only speak from my experience. And something one of my teachers, Naveen Mashan, always says is, everything you see is true and everything you don't see is also true. And a lot of times, by really listening to people having experiences that are unlike yours, will give you immense perspective and insight on how to come to a solution to a bigger problem. And I think that's kind of really what I started to see is that like the problems and the harm that was being perpetuated in wellness spaces to specifically BIPOC individual and BIPOC women started to come into focus, and I started to see it in a lot of different ways and be like, oh, this is systemic. This comes from the industry itself. And so I've been on a real mission to disrupt that and to lovingly, but in a way of establishing firm boundaries, to call out bullshit and to call out white supremacy, to call out racist acts, to call out oh God, what's the term? Not affiliation, but
Appropriation.
appropriation. Well, no. There's a lot of appropriation happening in the yoga spaces. But like when people see something that's happening and they don't speak up because it's like, oh, like alliance, like white alliance,
Ally?
whatever. Not allies. It's I forget the term, but it's when you don't call somebody else's racist behavior out because you are white. Solidarity, white solidarity. That was the word I was looking for. It's like I would see these things happen like in classrooms and nobody would say anything, and I'd be like, what the fuck? Like why? Like, that's such a terrible thing to happen, and the term white solidarity. And then the biggest thing is cultural appropriation, because again, like I said, yoga was never about the body. It was never about fitness. It was never about exercise. And I think we've done the practice a huge disservice by lumping it into the fitness and wellness industry, because it was a philosophical construct to organize the mind, not to be in shape. And in many ways, like fitness, the whole point of it is to be in a like cardiovascular state where your heart rate is up, and yoga is the complete opposite. It's about longevity. It's about defying the aging process so that you
Mm-hmm.
can be here for the long haul. Um, so I really want to share that in my teachings and also the spaces that I inhabit to really educate people on what yoga really is, where yoga comes from, and how we can appreciate the beauty, the rituals without appropriating it, which is a very slippery
Mm.
slope, but one I'm willing to explore.
Well, how does one do that? Because, you know, again, like you and I have a history of being in studios. We have this beautiful intersection with a lot of our teachings, and being there at the same time or just missing each other, which is kind of fabulous. But a lot of those spaces were created by brilliant, amazing white women who were also very harmful and very appropriative in so many ways. And if you were to tell them that, I know one specifically really sort of pushed back, right? And we saw that that led to her demise in the yoga world. She's still thriving, I'm sure. But but you know, we see this a lot, you know, and it's painful because we as BIPOC have to rectify that these people we hold dear, and that, like you said, we do sort of like uphold these hierarchies, um, are also harming us and harming other BIPOC. How do we? How would you direct someone to support the culture without appropriating it?
So the first thing that I would tell people to do is look at who is teaching you the practice. And if they all have the same identity and can come from the same walk of life, I would encourage them to start to explore taking classes or learning from people that look different from them, whether that
Mm.
be in age, in gender, in religious affiliation, whether that be, you know, sexual orientation or race. But you can learn a lot from people who don't have the same exact worldviews as you. Secondly, I would encourage people to start to read material written by authors of color. And around yoga specifically, authors of South Asian descent. Because I think a lot of the text, a lot of the resources, and a lot of the experts in the field are really people that aren't coming from it from a lived experience. It's much more academic, and the whole field of academia is wrought with patriarchal and white supremacy
Mhm.
problems. It's very problematic because it delegitimizes other forms of knowledge and wisdom and learning.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
and you can see that in the yoga industry. You can see how like a bunch of unqualified white people are now the masters and the gatekeepers of practices that came from the Indian subcontinent,
Mhm.
and how that colonial bias is embedded in the very nature of how it's taught, um, and who it's taught from, which I think is problematic. So I would ask people to like those are two tangible steps that one can do immediately. You know, because I think the other thing too with the work is that sometimes it can seem so overwhelming because when you start to like when the jig is up, you're like, oh my god, like there is so much at work here. I don't know where to begin. So I think like those are really tangible and easy places to begin the process of unlearning, so that people can understand the the cultural and historical context of the practice, um, but also to understand that like like we are not South Asian, many of us are not Hindu, and
Mm-hmm.
so we don't necessarily have to, incorporate those exact rituals in our mindfulness practices, but to understand where they come from so that there is this reverence, where there is this acknowledgement of like, hey, I am tipping my hat to all of the teachers that came before me, so that I can then take this information and infuse my narrative, my life experiences, so that it really does become a practice that is beneficial to you, because at the end of the day, that's all we have to speak from. And it's even in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says to Arjuna, it is better to fail at your own dharma, your own path, your own duty, than to live somebody else's perfectly, because the curse of having to only being able to speak from your experiences is that's all you know. The blessing is that your perspective of the world is uniquely yours and nobody else has it, which means it's worthy to share and to put it out into your communities and your relationships so that you can be spheres of influence.
How do you think that how how do you think we can begin to show people in the yoga community that there is um, it's not even the same path, or it's not even a different path, it's the same path that with yoga comes social justice, because that is a part of the greater non-harming, that is, I mean, the things that you said before, that it is a part of the greater. And why do you think that there's more of an inclination towards white saviorism, right? And we see that with all of these, like, go to Africa. Africa is everyone's like poor country, right? And it's not even a
Mm-hmm.
country, it's a continent, but
Continent, yeah.
it's everyone's core place, right? There's a lack of understanding of what is. How do you think that we show people that social justice, like getting out there in the muck and in the grime and the ugliness in order to create change, is yoga?
So yoga is a practice of action, um, and and to bring it back to the Bhagavad Gita, you always have a choice in life to take action or to not take action. When you take action, there are consequences to you taking action. When you don't take action, there are consequences to you not taking action. And again, if the practice of yoga is a practice of liberation and freedom, then what you do on the mat and how you show up to yourself should should directly correlate to how you show up to the world, how you show up to your communities, how you show up to your relationships. And it's said, I think, in the sutras, the moment you think you've arrived at the goal of yoga, you've lost it, you've missed it. And I think because so much of the yoga industry is really centered around neoliberal, colonial, um, capitalistic, and individualistic viewpoints, that it breeds spiritual narcissism, where people think that the work begins and ends on the mat, and begins and ends with who they identify as, and begins and ends with bypassing the relative truth of reality to access absolute truth, which it's textbook case of spiritual bypassing, which is pretty prevalent in the yoga and the wellness industries. And you know we kind of see how that breeds spiritual narcissism, because the whole idea of a guru, where it's a spiritual guide where you literally submit free will to the guru. You know, like when you study under the tutelage of a guru, like your life is not your own anymore. We've taken that concept and applied it to being a teacher, a professor, a professional, um, where we then take those same rituals and those same attitudes and those same principles and apply it to our Western society, where it then becomes almost like a dictatorship and dogmatic, where it's like you don't question the teacher, and it breeds this sort of hierarchy of I'm up here and you are down here. And when there's that hierarchy, there is a imbalance of power in the relationship. And what's that saying? Absolute power corrupts
Reps,
absolutely. So
absolutely.
like when people have that kind of access to individuals, it's very easy to fall into that. And I think that this dismantling of the individual and bringing it back to how does the individual contribute to the collective, right? Because, like, you know, healing and well-being is going to look different for not only individuals but different communities, you know. And so a lot of times, you know, like in yoga spaces, like what a privileged affluent white woman needs to feel good about herself is not the same as a Latinx woman or a black woman or a gay man, you know, necessarily. And it's not a one size fits all, right? And so by having this sort of decentering of one individual, but looking at it as like as a sangha, as a community, and drawing upon the wisdom that is already inherent within the community, I think is at least how I'm trying to show up in the spaces that I'm inhabiting, and modeling to other people that that like that this is the real yoga, you know, like it's not about the handstands. It's not about,
What?
I know, shocker. Newsflash. Newsflash. Because it's like, great, you can do a handstand, but if you're still a racist asshole when you walk out into the world, your yoga's not working.
Mhm.
You know, if you still say these platitudes of like we're all one, love and light, all lives matter, your yoga's not working. You're
Mhm.
missing the point. You're missing the wisdom. You're missing the teaching. Um, and you know, like I think there are like a good number of people that just don't know. And when they are actually taught with compassion and authenticity and real honesty, I've seen people change, you know? So that's what gives me faith. Um, Even though, like, right now in the United States specifically, it's like,
Ugh.
I don't know if it's ever going to change, but, you know, that doesn't mean we stop trying.
Yeah. We interviewed Michelle Johnson, the founder of Skill in Action.
Yes.
Badass.
Hmm.
Well, she posed the question, what are you practicing then? Right? If you are not doing the social justice work or the work, but you are still practicing yoga, like what is your practice? Which I think goes back to what you were saying about how yoga is seen and treated here in the United States, which is colonized and capitalized to where they have to make money and they have to look aesthetically pleasing. And you kind of answered this, but is there a way for, and you're starting that with your own studio, so please share how you're like reframing yoga practice in a capitalistic society that we still live under.
So I am the studio that I'm opening, which is called Empowered Yoga Studio, slated to open at the end of November in Venice, California. A little
Woo.
vlog talk about capitalism. um, the way that the business model is that there are several owners of the business, and we are all yoga teachers, and we all have equity in the company. So the incentive is that all of the profit that is generated from the studio goes back to the teachers. Because I think right now in a capitalistic, commodified industry, most of the time, unless you have the VC to start the business, yoga teachers who are the product, who are the experience, who are the people that are doing all of the labor, get shortchanged because the people with all the money call the shots. And even though that I have worked with some like problematic yoga studio owners, the difference between like places that I enjoyed teaching at and wanted to stay at and places that I really thought were toxic and really bad was leadership actually embodying the product that they were peddling, which is yoga. And oftentimes with these big corporations, with these big studios, they don't practice it. They just see it as a way to make profit off of it. Mm-hmm. And so what we're really trying to do is to use the studio as a platform for the teachers, so that the teachers, and we've hired a diverse background of teachers, a diverse perspectives of the practice. Like they're all coming with different modalities. There's not like a specific way of doing things, which is often, like in our yoga industry, like we talk about sequencing and really sequencing became this like big concept that was really a branding tool. It was a way to distinguish one business or one community from another. And that's really all there was to it. And there was all of this dogma about like, oh, this is the safe and healthy and efficient way. But like when you really start to study biomechanics, you're like, well, no, if you like understand the functionality of the body and teach it in a mindful way, you can teach anything, right? So we're really stepping away from all of that so that the teachers that are teaching at our studio are bringing their insights, their experience, their perspective, and their knowledge to really teach the community what yoga truly is. So that's how I'm trying to do it in a business venture, because in actuality, if we didn't live in a capitalistic society, I would teach for free because I love it so much, and it gives me such a sense of purpose and connection that like that is beyond any monetary value. But I can't say that to my landlord.
He doesn't care.
Capitalism. I'm not going to pay your rent.
They want money. But in tandem with that, I'm also part of a nonprofit organization called GaneshSpace, which is a 501c3 that is centered around uplifting and amplifying marginalized voices and experiences, and specifically focusing around 4 pillars: race, gender, sexual orientation, and body image. Because I think that that's also a bias that is also very prevalent in the yoga and wellness industry about being able-bodied. And like if this truly is a practice for everybody and anybody, then we need to share how people who are living with disabilities can still be yogis.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's actually something I wanted to touch on is that, we talk about inclusivity a lot, and we talk about decolonizing a lot. Even, I mean, especially this show is centered around that, and yet we all have our own bias and our own experiences that give us like it puts blinders on. And so becoming more aware that there are other experiences there. I'm trying to think of just one trans teacher that I know, or that I've heard of, or whose voices have been amplified. And I can't think of one, which is horrifying. There's so many layers to identity. And God, we have only highlighted. I look on Netflix and you just see the same 1,500 stories of like from like white voices. We get it. How we all know how Rome started,
Mm-hmm.
Sparta, whatever, right? But you will see all like the same stories told over and over again, led by different in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s. They just remake the same stories from the same. I want to see some new perspectives,
Actually,
and
Superman just came out as being bi.
I heard that.
Yes,
What?
yes.
So there's something new.
But
I mean,
is that new?
I
That's the
mean,
thing. What is that?
so I think,
Is that a marketing ploy?
I, in some ways, yes, and I think I think this kind of ties to like the whole concept of diversity and inclusivity trainings.
Mm-hmm.
I think has become a buzzword and a concept that a lot of businesses and entities are now starting to do because it's socially conscious and responsible, but
Mm-hmm.
it's all lip service. There is no intention of actually doing any of that work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, now, I'm a gay Latinx man, so I have more exposure to sort of different identities in regards to like gender and sexual orientation. So I do have a couple of trans teachers that are trying to sort of pave the way, but like I think, like to make things inclusive, you have to name and support what makes us diverse, and a lot of like social justice trainings that I've done before, before people come to the table for the larger conversations, it often starts in um, affinity or focus groups of individuals that have similar identities and similar life experiences, so that there is a way to unpack and in many ways commiserate, just some of the experiences that is shared, because like, I think like on this call right now, like we are all people of color, but your experiences as a black woman is going to be different from Laura's experience as an API woman, which is going to be different from my experience as a Latinx man. So I don't think that there's anything wrong, and I actually think it's important to support these affinity spaces so that people have the chance to connect, to process, in some ways grieve together, and then come together being able to cross those identity lines. But if you just expect everybody to come to the table as is and then try to talk about this, a lot of times what ends up happening is that the people of color end up being more harmed in that process, because they have to sit and listen to the like white fragility and the white guilt and witness the white tears, where it's like that's not beneficial for me, so I think, and something we're trying to do at GaneshSpace is to really honor the affinity groups and to allow spaces within the inclusive space to have these opportunities to connect and to almost build little families within the greater context of the community. And so far, it's been really successful because a lot of times, like, because like you said, like we all have biases, right? And like just because somebody experiences racism doesn't mean that they can't also be misogynistic and homophobic,
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yep.
which, and I think when we are talking about oppression, it's very easy for one to cling to their marginalized identities. It is almost a default to not take accountability for where they're not showing up to do the work. It's like, and like, when I first came to these conversations about anti-blackness, the first thing I would say was like, well, what about being gay? Or what about being Latinx? And I realized that like that's a conditioning, uh, um, almost like a defense mechanism to not look at where I am not where I am perpetuating anti-blackness, where I am perpetuating internalized biases or internalized superiority. And so I think, like having those affinity groups help like-minded people start to, in a safe space, see what other biases they're carrying, because nobody's perfect, like I saw a meme on Instagram that was like, there is no objective reality. There is no objective truth. And and some days I really believe that because, like I don't I don't know what some other life experiences are unless I listen and really earnestly try to learn,
Mm.
And I think that's the difference too in having compassion for people because like again there are people who don't know, and there are people who make mistakes and people who say the wrong thing or think the wrong thing, but if there is this eagerness to learn and a real effort to do better, then that's how we make spaces inclusive, to actually support the the fumblings and the stumblings around how to be more accepting and inclusive in our own way of being, and and to create spaces that like really support that, which are few and far between, unfortunately.
Yeah. I love how you said all of that, and it does remind me that we have to, well, at least for me, I have to also remember compassion for people who, because there was a time when I didn't know as well, and I had to do that work for myself as well. So um, I know sometimes I'm just like, how could you not get it? It's all around us now.
Literally.
It's like everywhere. I'm curious just to hear your perspective and just how you feel about even in the last year. So I'm a Kundalini yoga teacher, and I kind of stepped away from that whole cult. Excuse me, did I say that? Yes, I did because it felt very cultish to me for a little while. Brittany's laughing. I studied it. I studied it in India, and then when I came back to the U.S., I was in it, and the kind of falling of the guru archetype of like famous yoga teachers. Like, what are your thoughts, and how can they come back, or is there a comeback? Is there anything they can do?
I think, well, everybody anybody can come back, right? It's just a question of are they gonna come back changed or repeating the same thing that they've always done. um and bhakti yoga was like a big it is a big foundation of my practice and my teaching, which is the chanting and the utterance of Sanskrit mantras. And like you, I have been to India many, many times. 2021 was actually the first year in 5 years that I didn't spend the month of February in India. And I go and I learn and I study, and even in this social awareness, I have even felt slightly uncomfortable and tentative around sharing those practices because I'm not South Asian.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think, again, like being critical in the source of where you're studying from, and like, and I love that because like the stuff that came out about Yogi Bhajan and the whole Kundalini sect, what is very problematic, and yet like a lot of those practices are like revelatory,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's like, so how do we, how are we able to like distinguish the technology from the vessel, from the vehicle, because oftentimes the vessel, the vehicles are human, and humans are flawed, and in many ways, uh, it's that guru culture that makes them think that they are like absolute, you
Yeah.
know. And I do think that there are ways for people to come back, especially if they like take accountability and acknowledge the harm that they've done, which I think many of them don't, because I think, again, like yoga celebrities are rooted in spiritual narcissism, and like that is, I think, something that, like, if they don't have that identity, then who are they, so that's something that, like, I think a lot of them will probably never let go of. Again, never say never, but I don't foresee people like that changing. But like, I think that finding ways of taking, because like, I think when you really understand the technique of a culture, like I love the metaphor of cooking, right? There's a universal technique to cooking, but you learn cooking through a cultural reference, right? You learn cooking by what ingredients you find at your local supermarket. But then when you really understand the technique of cooking,
Mm-hmm.
then you can start to explore and play with other ingredients that come from other cultures that are not yours. And whenever you do something with reverence, refinement, and a real honoring, most people aren't going to have a problem with it.
Yeah.
It's when it is taken from a group that's already disempowered and then sold back to them in a way that is monetized and continues to assert that oppression. That's when it becomes appropriation. That's when it becomes problematic, because like there's so much beauty and so much wisdom that comes from practices of the Indian subcontinent. So does that mean if you're not South Asian that you can't practice or teach yoga? No, I don't think so. But there's more work that has to be done on our end than somebody who has a lived experience of being South Asian.
Yeah. The studio that I used to be a part of is in Venice Beach and New York City. You're probably going to guess what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I would not wear a turban. I would not put Yogi Bhajan's picture on my altar because I'm not Sikh, and I'm not going to pray to a man's face. I just thought that whole thing was weird. And a lot of the things that my cohorts would say to me is, "Oh, you're just cherry picking what's convenient for you." And I'm like, okay, I kind of did that with my religion. I didn't see like a problem with that. And then with the whole demise of everything that came out last year, and God rest her soul, Guru Jagat passed away. I just saw that as very symbolic of the death of the guru culture in America, and just like how toxic and how controlling that whole thing was, and still is. And in certain ways, I'm grateful that I didn't fall into that trap and didn't fall into, um, all of that. But at the same time, I'm like, is there any way I can practice this and still teach this um, without all of that crap? What you
I
would
mean,
answer?
I
Yeah.
I think I mean I honestly think I think that is what makes a good teacher a good teacher, when they take their life experiences, all of their skill sets, all of the technology that they know, and put it into their offerings so that it then becomes authentic to you. Because nothing is original, right? Everything that we do has been done and said for millennia. The X factor is time is changing. That is the variable that has to allow the practices and the way the practices are practiced. Wow, that was really redundant. The way the practices are practiced, um, to evolve and grow and to continue to fit the needs of the practitioner. But the teaching, the universal message, the archetype is always the same. And whenever I encounter somebody that says that it's my way or the highway or this is the only way, that's a red flag to me, because I think a real spiritual guide, a real guru, um, will see the similarities in different practices, in different methods of technology. I think that's like what's so incredible to see about like the Dalai Lama, who is a Buddhist yet has no problems breaking bread and having relations with other religious world leaders that follow a different path. But this understanding that it's all taking us to the same destination, it's really finding the path that is right and authentic for you. Which is why I think, like if you ever come to one of my yoga classes, like there's mantra chanting, there's functional range mobility movement, there is traditional yoga asana, there's pranayama, and there's also my own insights of my lived experience. Um, because you don't want somebody to just be a cookie cutter, and you don't want somebody to just mimic what somebody else has already done, because after a while that people can tell, and people can feed off of that. And as a teacher, I always say, if I'm going to stand in front of a group of people and demand their time and attention, I have to have a real clear idea of what I want to say.
Mm.
And I think, as long as one is teaching from that place and sharing in an authentic and reverent way, then that's how you take what works for you and use it and apply it. And the practices that are that doesn't resonate with me, there should be freedom in that, and there should be permission to do that. Because I mean, again, unless you are signing up to be in a monastery or in a community where your free will is submitted, um you know your personal practice is just that, personal.
Can I ask you, in your opinion, what work do you think that BIPOC has to do, and what work do you think that white body people have to do?
So I think, and again, BIPOC it's, I mean, I'm glad the term is there, but it's also sort of a monolithic term to sort of encompass so many different walks of life. Um, I think, like people who are BIPOC but not black have to continue to interrogate and investigate all of the structures and scaffolding that is built inside to perpetuate anti-blackness. I think that's like a really big thing for um, for people who are of color that aren't African descent. um, I think, like, men have a lot of unpacking to do around how being a man in patriarchal society um, is advantageous, and to understand that positionality that they have regardless of their race. um, and then I think, for for white women specifically, um, to, for them to really be feminists, to get very interested and curious about all of the different barriers that are put in place to other women that don't look like themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because it's very easy for, you know, white women to cling to the sisterhood of feminism, but then cling to their whiteness and forgo that sisterhood when it doesn't serve them. Um, and, you know, all white men have to do a lot of work on privilege and power. I mean, it's true.
It's so true. You
It's
don't even
really true.
understand.
I mean, there's it's kind of like, like, even in the gay community, and it's interesting being out here in LA. Like, I felt like the gay community in New York um, was more diverse, and the voice of the gay community, like specifically like the gay male community, um, had a lot of echoes of like Black culture, whereas out here it's very much
White.
a white culture. And, even like white gay men, like, there's a lot of unpacking of privilege and positionality and power that they have, even though they know what it feels like to be oppressed. um, and I, again, like, it's very like general and very like, but I think, like, the point of it is that, like, we all have work to do, and
Mm-hmm.
we all have work that is going to be individual to the identities that we have and the spaces we inhabit. um, because, you know that's what makes it universal, is that it's all different.
Yeah. All white men, period. All white men.
Where the hashtag is gonna come up somewhere? Not all white men. I'm
Not
ready for
all.
it. Yes,
All white men.
all.
Sorry, I had to say that. I was going off on a rant about this right before you came on, and I was just like, okay, cool down. Not all white men. Not all white men. Last question, because I know we've gone over time. What is your message for the world?
My message to the world is that by simply being alive, and by having breath in your body, and taking up the little corner of earth that you inhabit, you have every right to happiness. You have every right to joy. You have every right to peace. And when you truly can access that, your mission is to then pass it on and to leave the world a better place than you found it. Um, and that's really what I hope, if I have to say, like, my legacy, like, that is something that I taught and embodied in my actions and in my life.
You're such a
Wow.
beautiful soul, Felipe.
Oh my gosh.
For the past hour.
I, I truly, I am so honored that. Well, first off, I am so proud of the fact that the two of you have created this venture and are creating space to have these conversations, and so honored to be invited and um, to participate in it because I think it's imperative, and especially if one calls themselves a yogi or a yoga teacher, like these are the questions that you need to be having with yourself and your communities.
Mm, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Ah.